Hi, during this lecture we are going to go over the tissue level of organization. So in the human body we have a lot of different types of tissues. So you can define a tissue as a group of cells that kind of have similar function and structure. The human body has over 200 different types of cells, and they're clubbed into 4 basic tissue types. A tissue is a group of cells that have a similar structure and a similar function. We have 4 primary types of tissues, and they are epithelial tissues, connective tissues, muscular tissues, and nervous tissues. So first, talking about epithelial tissues, you can sum this up as tissues that form surfaces, external or internal surfaces of some kind. Then you have connective tissues. Connective tissues, as the name suggests, they connect either epithelial tissue to some other kind of tissue, epithelial to muscular, connective to other connective. They basically connect stuff. And then you have 2 specialized tissues, muscular tissues and nervous tissues. Both muscle tissues and nervous tissues have one property in common, and that property is that they can transmit something known as action potential. So when we get to our muscles unit, we will talk about what an action potential is. So they have the ability to be electrically excited. So both muscular tissues as well as nervous tissues can transmit action potentials. Nervous tissue can exclusively also generate action potentials. Muscle tissues can transmit them, but cannot generate action potentials. Nervous tissue can both generate as well as transmit action potentials. The exclusive property to muscular tissues is that they have the ability to contract and relax. So contractibility and elasticity is a property that is exclusive to muscular tissues. The sub-branch of biology that deals with studies of tissues is called histology, and it involves extensive microscopy as well. Before we go into each and every one of the tissue types, we will talk about how tissues are adhered, or how cells in a tissue are adhered to one another. So we are going to talk about cell junctions. A junction is a relationship between one cell and another cell. So there are different types of these relationships based on what the function of the tissue is, where it's located, and what the job of the tissue is. So let's look at the different types of cell junctions. The first type of cell junction we're going to look at is a tight junction. Just as the name suggests, it is tight. It is leak-proof. So anytime you have a tight junction, you can be assured that it is a leak-proof junction. So you're going to see these junctions in parts of the body that hold liquids in. Gastrointestinal tract, urinary system. So anytime you have a part of the body that it has to hold liquids in, you have tight junctions. So what we're going to look at over here is this illustration, where this is one plasma membrane of one cell. This is the plasma membrane of the adjacent cell. Now what you have here in a tight junction is transmembrane proteins. So you have these transmembrane proteins that basically look like string of beads. So here's a string of beads, here's a string of beads. So you have the transmembrane protein of one plasma membrane attached to a transmembrane protein of another plasma membrane, forming a tight, leak-proof junction. You see these in immune-privileged areas and areas that hold liquids in, for example, the GI tract. The next type of junction we're going to look at is known as an adherens junction. Now think of an adherens junction as a stack of paper with a rubber band attached to it. So here's a plasma membrane of one cell here's the plasma membrane of another cell. Now what happens here is that you have glycoproteins. So everybody at this point should know what transmembrane proteins are. So you have these transmembrane proteins called glycoproteins, which are a combination of a carbohydrate and a protein. And this particular one is called cadherin. So you have cadherin molecules that are sticking out into that intercellular space, and they form what looks like a zipper. So you have a zipper that's made up of cadherin that is forming the actual junction, and then you have a protein-based rubber band that holds these plasma membranes together. So that's the rubber band. And that rubber band is made up of the protein actin. So it's a type of a microfilament. Now these adherent junctions, because of that rubber band, so think of a rubber band. What is a rubber band going to do? It's going to prevent stretching. So when you stretch a rubber band, it can only stretch so much, right? So that is what this microfilament is going to do as well. So these are found in parts of the body that have to stretch to a certain extent, but cannot stretch to an unlimited extent. So again, an example of this is the GI and the urinary tracts. The next cell junction we're going to look at is called a desmosome. A desmosome is like a thumbtack. So what we have here is plasma membrane of one cell, plasma membrane of the adjacent cell. We again have the zipper that is made up of the glycoprotein cadherin. And what we have here, instead of a rubber band, we have a spot weld. Now this spot weld is also made up of a protein, but this time it is not made of a microfilament actin. It is made up of intermediate filaments. And intermediate filaments are made up of the protein keratin. So what you're seeing here is that thumbtack that is made up of keratin. Now keratin is a stronger protein than actin, and therefore a desmosome is a tighter junction or a stronger junction than an adherens junction. Now one quality about a desmosome is that it is permeable. It is permeable to certain substances. It allows substances to pass. It's a stronger junction, and it's found in areas such as the uterus. Uterus has to stretch, come back to its normal position, heart, and in epidermal tissues. The epidermis is the outermost layer of the skin. So you have these keratin-based junctions present in the outermost layer of your skin as well. The next junction that we are going to go over is called a hemidesmosome. Anytime you have the word hemi or demi, it refers to half. Now a hemidesmosome is half of a desmosome. Now instead of binding the plasma membrane of one cell to the plasma membrane of another cell, a hemidesmosome is going to bind the plasma membrane of one cell to something known as the basement membrane. The basement membrane is a membrane that separates epithelial tissues from connective tissues. So what you're seeing here is half of a spot weld. You have the pink plasma membrane, you have the glycoprotein cadherin integrin that is right here, and you have the keratin spot weld that is right here. Now this is called a hemidesmosome because instead of binding a plasma membrane to a plasma membrane, it is binding a plasma membrane to a basement membrane. That is a key term to remember here. The next kind of cell junction we are going to talk about is a gap junction. Now a gap junction is a water-filled junction, and it is made up of proteins called connexons, right here. Now what it is just a series of transmembrane proteins that are filled with water. And they're usually seen in cardiac tissue and smooth muscle and in fetal tissues. So what you see here is a transmembrane protein attached to another transmembrane protein, and that gap between those two transmembrane proteins is going to be filled up with water. So those were the cell junctions. From here on out, anytime we talk about cell junctions, we are either going to talk about tight junctions, adherence junctions, desmosomes, hemidesmosomes, or gap junctions. The next concept that we're going to look at is embryonic tissues. So when does development begin? So we're going to go down to the level of the embryo. So we're talking the zygote, which is nothing but the sperm and the egg fertilized, coming down the fallopian tube of the woman and implanting itself into the uterus. Now the embryo begins its journey as a single cell, and it divides by mitosis into 3 primary germ layers. So the germ layers, you can refer to the germ layers as kind of like the primitive or the rudimentary layers from which any and every adult tissue is going to form. And there are 3 germ layers. So think of a ball of cells. This ball of cells starts to divide, and it first divides into an outer layer and an inner layer. So anytime you have an outer something, it is referred to as an ecto. Inner is referred to as endo. So think of a ball of cells first splitting into 2 layers. The outer one is called the ectoderm, and the inner one here, so the outer one here is in pink, and the inner one here is in yellow. So the outer one is called the ectoderm, and the inner one is called the endoderm. And then you have the cavity here, which is the amniotic cavity. Now, as it keeps dividing, there starts to appear a middle layer, right here in green. And that is referred to as the mesoderm. So this slide here tells you exactly what develops from the ectoderm, what develops from the endoderm, and what develops from the mesoderm. So it would be a really good idea to familiarize yourself with what parts of the body originate out of each one of the 3 primary germ layers. So now we're going to go on to talking about the individual tissue types. So the first type of tissue we are going to go over is epithelial tissues. Epithelial tissues, the characteristic of epithelial tissues is that they form surfaces, inner or outer surfaces of the body. Now here's a generic image of an epithelial tissue. Now, an epithelial tissue will have cells of varying size and shape. Now the junction between these cells could be either one of the junctions that we talked about earlier. Anytime you see an epithelial layer, you know that at one end of that epithelial layer is going to be a basement membrane. So that right there is the basement membrane. And whenever you have the basement membrane, on the other side of the basement membrane, you are going to have some kind of a connective tissue. So this is what a generic epithelial tissue looks like. Now the part of the epithelial tissue that is oriented towards the basement membrane is called its basal surface. The part of the epithelial tissue that is located towards the free or the non-basal end is called its apical surface. So think of different surfaces on your body. Your skin is a surface. The inside of your mouth is a surface. Your tongue is a surface. The inside of your throat is a surface. The inside of your gastrointestinal tract is a surface. The outside of your stomach is a surface. So we have different internal and external surfaces. Now, one characteristic of epithelial tissues is that they can house cells of secretion. Now, a secretory cell can secrete stuff like hormones, mucus, sweat, saliva, tears, or any kind of a secretory product. Now, talking about the classification of epithelial tissues, there are 2 ways you can classify epithelial tissues. One is the number of layer of cells, and 2 is the actual shape of the cell itself. So first, let's look at cells based on the number of layers. Now, the blue line here is the basement membrane. So always look for that basement membrane. In a simple epithelium, you only have one layer of tissues. So look at these tissues right here. You only have one layer of cells. So each cell has a basal end. Each cell has an apical end. Moving on to stratified epithelium. Strata means layers. So this means that this epithelium has more than one layer. So take a look at this. This bottom layer of cells has the basal end. This layer neither has the basal nor the apical end, and the topmost layer has an apical end. So it's multiple layers of cells in stratified epithelium. Now the next type of epithelium based on the number of layers is called pseudostratified epithelium. Pseudo means false. Stratified means layers. So what this means is that this tissue looks like it has multiple layers, but if we look closely, it is actually just one layer of cells. Now what this means, if you look closely, is that you will notice that each cell in a pseudostratified epithelium will have a basal layer. However, each cell may not have an apical or a free surface. So we look at simple stratified and pseudostratified epithelium. The next set of classification is going to be based on the individual shape of the cells. Now, anytime you have cells that are wider than they are taller, they're flat, wide cells, that is referred to as the squamous epithelium. When you have cells that are cube-shaped or equally tall and wide, they are referred to as the cuboidal epithelium. Or you have big pillar-like cells. They're taller than they're wider. So those are called columnar cells. Now think about this. When we combine these two sets of classifications, all of these combinations exist. You can have simple squamous epithelium, you can have simple cuboidal epithelium, and simple columnar epithelium. Same thing for pseudostratified and same thing for stratified. So first let us take a look at simple squamous epithelium. Simple meaning it's just one layer of cells, squamous meaning that they are flat cells, and epithelium meaning that they are epithelial cells. Now I would suggest familiarizing yourself with looking at micrographs. This is a light micrograph of the small intestine. And what you're seeing here is the simple squamous epithelium. Now the first thing when you look at a micrograph I would suggest doing is to find the basement membrane. So right here I'm going to draw where I see the basement membrane. So you'll see a line that demarcates flat-looking cells from something that looks like a vague kind of shaded region. So that right there is the basement membrane. Now what you're seeing here is the free surface, and this is the nucleus of a simple squamous cell. Here is another simple squamous cell. Here's another simple squamous cell. So that is the layer of flat cells, and there you have your simple squamous epithelium. Now places where you would find simple squamous epithelium. Your blood vessels. Blood vessels are your arteries and veins of the blood capillaries. They carry oxygenated blood to every cell in your body. They take deoxygenated blood back. Now, each of your blood vessels, no matter how big, no matter how small, are lined by a simple squamous epithelium. And that is referred to as the endothelium. So endothelium is a type of simple squamous epithelium that lines your entire circulatory system. You also have simple squamous epithelium in your lungs to absorb all of that oxygen. You have it in your kidneys as well as your upper gastrointestinal tract. The next epithelium that we're going to look at is the simple cuboidal epithelium. So take a look at this micrograph. It is from a longitudinal section of the kidney. Now the job of the kidney is to take in blood, filter blood, absorb all the nutrients, and create urine with all the toxins and impurities. So what its job is to basically take substance A and convert it into substance B. So you know that it's going to have some kind of tube to collect stuff, right? So here's what the light micrograph that we're looking at. This is a lumen. This space right here is a lumen. This is where urine is going to get collected. So anytime you have a space, so that's a lumen, that's a lumen, that's a lumen. Anytime you have a tube that is going to collect something, it is called a lumen. Now over here, let us first look for the basement membrane. Right here is the basement membrane for the simple cuboidal epithelium. This is the free or the apical end, and you have these cuboidal cells with its nucleus clearly demarcated. So you can see that it is one layer of cells, it's cuboidal, hence the simple cuboidal epithelium. The next epithelium that we are going to go over is the simple columnar epithelium. Now this is a micrograph from your small intestine again. Now think about it. What is the job of your small intestine? It is to absorb nutrients from the food that you're eating. So you'd absorb more nutrients the more surface area you would have. The less surface area, the less absorption. The more surface area, the more absorption. So take a look closely at this micrograph here. Let us first find that basement membrane. And it is right here. There's that basement membrane. So this side of the cells would be the basal end. This side of the cells would be the apical end. You see that each cell is tall and pillar-like, and there is only one layer of cells. So hence, it is the simple columnar epithelium. And you can see the nuclei of these cells very clearly as well. Now, if you think about your gastrointestinal tract, it is a mucousy surface. It is completely lined with a mucous membrane. Now, a mucus production cell is called a goblet cell. So what you're seeing right here, this cell right here, is a goblet cell. A goblet cell is a mucus-producing cell. Moving on to pseudostratified columnar epithelium. Remember, pseudostratified means that it looks like there are false layers. It looks like there are layers, but there really aren't layers. So the basement membrane is right here, and you have cells that each have the basal end, but not every cell here has an apical end. And this is a micrograph from a section of the trachea right here. Now, the trachea is part of your upper respiratory system. And one of the jobs of hair-like structures called cilia in your upper respiratory system is to beat outwards to keep debris and foreign particles out of your lungs. So what you see here, this fuzz right here on top, are the cilia. So we've looked at all of the different types of simple epithelia. Now we're going to look at stratified epithelia. Stratified epithelia are epithelia where you have multiple layers of cells. Now think about this. If you had a part of your body that was exposed to mechanical stress, would you be able to afford it for it to be a simple epithelium? No. So parts of your body that are subjected to routine wear and tear, your skin, for example, the inside of your mouth, you're speaking, you're chewing. So there's a lot of mechanical stress exerted on these structures. So these are structures that are made up of multiple layers of cells, and they are referred to as stratified epithelia. Now, in stratified epithelia, you can have multiple layers of the cells wherein the older layers end up dying and accumulating a protein called keratin. Your skin is the perfect example of this, and hence the skin is also referred to as the keratinized epithelium. We have a very tough protein called keratin on the top layers of our skin, so when our skin is subjected to mechanical stress, we don't always bleed. Now, non-keratinized epithelium is when the top layer of the cells is not dead and accumulated with keratin. So the first micrograph that we are looking at here is a stratified squamous epithelium. You're looking at a micrograph from the longitudinal section of the vagina. Now, right here is the basement membrane, and you can clearly see multiple layers of cells, and you can see that as the cells grow outward, the younger cells are towards the basement membrane, the older cells are towards the free surface. Now, keratinized is when, in your skin, when you accumulate keratin. Non-keratinized is what you see in this particular micrograph. You see that each cell on the top here looks like it has a nucleus as well. If it was dead, it wouldn't have a nucleus. So keratinized epithelium is made up of dead cells that have accumulated keratin. Non-keratinized is just multiple layers of live cells. The next epithelium is the stratified cuboidal epithelium. Now what you're seeing here in this micrograph is a lumen. You should know that that blank space is the lumen. Now, right here you see the basement membrane, and you see that there are multiple layers of cuboidal looking cells. It's not just one layer. So that is the stratified cuboidal epithelium. And stratified cuboidal epithelium is usually seen in a gland or duct of some kind. So you know that it's going to either secrete or produce something. The next one is a very rare type of epithelium called stratified columnar epithelium, meaning that you have pillar-like cells arranged in multiple layers. Basement membrane is right here. You see this is one layer of cells. Each has a basal end. Here is another layer of cells with multiple layers of pillar-like cells. Parts of the urethra had the stratified squamous epithelium. The last epithelium that we're going to look at is called transitional epithelium. Transition. Think about the term transition. Transition means temporary, intermediate. Now, transitional epithelium is a type of a stratified epithelium. And here's the basement membrane. You see multiple layers of cells. And this epithelium is usually seen in parts of the body that have to change size very rapidly. Example, the urinary bladder. Now, look at the apical end of the cells right here. They have that rounded appearance. Think of it as a balloon. If the balloon is stretched, it is flat. If the balloon is filled with air, it becomes rounded. So anytime the bladder is relaxed, the cells appear with round edges. as the bladder starts filling up with urine, it becomes stretched. As it becomes stretched, this rounded appearance is going to start appearing flat.